Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. After an absolutely shambolic start of the season, rumours are starting to emerge that Alpine may just call it a day with their Formula 1 team and go back to just being an engine supplier from 2026 and beyond. This potentially opens the door if Alpine were to sell to another team such as Andretti to come onto the grid and also arguably make the grid more competitive than where Alpine presently find themselves. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Firstly, on the driver stuff, of course, that was a picture of Ricciardo and Piastri out in Australia for the Grand Prix this weekend. Also rumours on the driver market. I'm sure that every few days we're going to have big discussions on this because like every seat, apart from a few, are taken for next year now. Hülkenberg is said to be a priority for Audi. Of course, they are coming in fully now, 100% taking over the Sauber team from 2026 and beyond. The initial implication was, well, did they really want to put their branding on the Sauber car yet when it's not particularly good? But potentially just for next year, they might say, you know, okay, we are basically going to be Audi now, and that's certainly the case from 2026 and onwards, and they've confirmed after some rumours that they might pull out that no, Audi is going to be an F1 project. Hülkenberg is said to be a priority target for that team. I'm sure that Sainz would be another possibly good target as well for those guys, but Sainz I'm sure would much prefer to go to Mercedes, or even Red Bull could be an option depending on the chaos that unfolds over the coming weeks. This could, of course, open up a Haas seat for Behrman, questions on whether Magnussen will stay, but it feels like an absolute impossibility that both Zhou and Bottas will stay at Audi Sauber next year. Maybe Bottas will, but it seems kind of doubtful that Zhou will stay around, and even Bottas, to be fair, maybe there are other seats available. Will they be at Alpine, or will they be at another team that could potentially replace Alpine? That is a big discussion of the last couple of days. Quick update on the Red Bull stuff as well. Yesterday we talked about this remarkable secret contract clause that Verstappen has had added into his contract by Dr. Helmut Marko, who was, as a director of Red Bull Racing, apparently acting on behalf of Red Bull behind the back of Horner and of others. And yesterday this was reported in Autosport, and today Planet F1 and Thomas Maher say yes, they understand that a clause that was inserted into Verstappen's contract that allows him to leave the contract if Marko's tenure ends does exist, and was supposedly inserted without the knowledge of Horner or any other senior members of the parent company. So there's now multiple places reporting that this is indeed true, and it just adds so much more depth to what was already a remarkable story, and of course there's way more to come. Subscribe if you haven't already, all that good stuff. I said yesterday we hit 45,000 subs, it was actually 46,000, so even better than I thought, but I thank you again. Quickly on the McLaren, their car is actually pretty good. Compared to last year, they've made massive strides. They are, from last year to this year, in terms of Bahrain, Jeddah to Bahrain and Jeddah, they are by far the most improved. There is one team which is by far the least improved, and we will discuss them in the coming minutes. However, they still have pretty poor DRS efficiency. It was a problem that affected them most certainly in Jeddah when Piastri was trying his best to get past Hamilton, and sure, Hamilton defended well, but the DRS wasn't operating particularly well on the McLaren, and despite the Mercedes being an absolute tractor in Sector 1, it still wasn't enough for the McLaren to overtake by the end of the lap. Lando Norris as well has been somewhat frustrated by the car actually, and says that he was hopeful for further progress in, well, effectively suiting his own driving style. The McLaren has historically and notoriously been a pretty challenging car to drive. Ricciardo struggled with this big time. Norris can live with the car a bit more on edge, but we saw even at the end of last season, they made upgrades to last year's car, but Norris made a few high-profile qualifying mistakes at the end of last year, arguably because the car was very much more on a knife edge than they would have liked to have been the case. And Norris is saying that actually this new car is faster, but it's not quite fast in the ways they would like it to be. And Norris was coming into the season saying, this is the year I'm going to get my race win. Doesn't necessarily seem like a guarantee at all. That's going to be the case for now. A couple of things on Mercedes as well. This was even spotted kind of just by comparison, really, comparing the Red Bull and the Mercedes setup for Jeddah and seeing how, to compensate for their lower rear wing angle, Mercedes actually run with more load on the beam wing, which are these parts here where the arrows are. So Mercedes were playing around with all sorts of stuff in Jeddah, but the data is actually so damning on Mercedes that I just wonder where they're going to be in Australia this upcoming weekend, because Toto Wolff says, we're working hard to understand why our performance hasn't reflected expectations. They may turn up on Thursday in the media day and say, yep, we've fixed it, we know what's happened, but it seems kind of doubtful that's the case, and they've said that how many times over the last 3 years to effectively no avail. And this is even some analysis done here by Autosport that said, yes, the Mercedes W15 was, over the course of a single lap, or even over the race distance, faster faster than last year's W14 at Jeddah, and over most of the lap it was significantly faster, but actually the W15 was slower in Sector 1 than last year's W14 was, which is, there's not many cars on the grid that are slower, even in any area at all, than last year's car. Especially, it's not like last year's W14 was a rocket ship, right? They had problems with that car, certainly at the start of the season, and continuing onwards throughout the year as well. So, if you look at the data, during some of those corners in Sector 1, he was lifting much more this year than last year, losing about 10 kph, a big deal, dropped nearly 1.5 tenths just through the Turn 4 complex. Now, he recovered that lap time delta over the rest of the lap because the car is faster in the medium and the low speed corners, but it's actually slower in the high speed, which is pretty damning, right? That last year's Mercedes was, at least in some elements, better than this year's Mercedes. So lots for them to figure out. Of course, they're fourth in the championship as it stands, just behind McLaren. Ferrari a second, and Red Bull have barely dropped a point so far. Australia, of course, was the scene of a very chaotic race last year where Mercedes, I'm pretty sure, scored their first podium of the season. Of course, Hamilton came second in last year's race that finished behind the safety car. Well, they had a great start to last year's Grand Prix, right? When Russell got Verstappen into Turn 1, Hamilton got Verstappen into Turn 3, Turn 4, whatever it is. Over the course of the Grand Prix, Verstappen got back in front, but also 2022, that was a Leclerc Grand Chelem, right? He dominated that Grand Prix, and of course, Verstappen retired in that race with a, I don't know exactly what issue it was, some sort of fuel pump issue or something, what that was, that he retired from the race with, right? So it has been the scene of some chaotic races over the last couple of years. We'll see if this race is similar. Pirelli are trying to make it more entertaining. This year, they're actually gone a step softer in the compounds. You guys might remember that in 2022, Alex Albon did that remarkable 58-lap stint on the hard tyres, and then he went to the softs and did one more lap to finish out the Grand Prix and got a point for his efforts. Last year, the Williams and Albon were also very quick, if you don't remember, that he was, P6 at one point, before then he put it in the wall just before that long curvy back straight. Basically, it was here he put it in the wall, right, where this first arrow is at the end of Sector 1. So, unfortunate scenes. This year, though, they've gone for the softer compounds to try and make it so the tyres don't last as long. I think this is a major issue in Jeddah, where the safety car was maybe inevitable, but after the safety car happens, everyone could easily go on one set of hard tyres to the end of the Grand Prix, which is not always for the best. The more stops you get in a Grand Prix, generally speaking, the more entertaining that it tends to be. Of course, if you make the tyre compound softer, the drivers will arguably just do more tyre saving, so maybe it doesn't make much difference. But we shall see. They've gone for the softer compounds possible, and it also might be the first time this season that some teams will even use the C5. Because if you don't remember, back in Bahrain for testing, some teams didn't even take any C5 compound tyres. They just ran C4 and upwards, whereas some teams did take the C5, and the first couple of races of the year, there's been no C5 available, the softest possible compound. So some teams won't even use that yet on their car until this weekend, where of course it will be the qualifying tyre. But I'm not sure it's going to make that much difference to Alpine. So there were some funny tweets going around about this. This seems to be like a Oscar Piastri fan account, which is quite funny, just because Piastri, Alonso, they were in that Alpine mess over the last couple of years. They have successfully escaped from it, and all the things that are banned, if they were to ban a tractor, then Alpine wouldn't even be arriving to the track this weekend, because their struggles have continued into this season and apparently could continue into next season as well. We've made the jokes about this. They talked about their 100 race plan to win races, to win championships. The 100 race plan seems to have been after 100 races, you're at the back of the grid. And for Alpine, it's like, well, where do we go from here? They've been reasonably competitive over the last couple of seasons. 2021, of course, they won a Grand Prix with Esteban Ocon. 2022, despite some chronic unreliability, especially for Fernando Alonso, the car wasn't atrocious. And even last year, there were some glimpses of the car being okay, apart from when they crashed each other out. The other issue that Alpine have is that their car is, I think by quite some way, the most unreliable on the grid right now. The Ferrari, of course, was highly problematic in 2022, as was the Haas, as has kind of been the AlphaTauri, to be fair, and even the Red Bull right at the start of 2022, but of course that changed tune very quickly indeed. But as time has gone on, the Alpine is just a nightmare of a machine. Obviously, Pierre Gasly didn't even get to race in Jeddah because his gearbox failed or whatever before the Grand Prix even started. And mechanical DNFs are pretty rare nowadays for most teams. But for Alpine, not only is the car slow and ugly and overweight, but it's also unreliable. This is why that they have this horribly ugly livery and design as well. I don't know if you guys heard about this story, but the rumor is that if you guys heard about Red Bull failing the crash test because their chassis was not strong enough to withstand the crash tests that the FIA give it, Alpine also failed the test, but apparently they didn't expect to. Red Bull go in with the intention of, okay, we are going to go right on the limit of what's possible, and okay, we fail it first time, fine, add a bit more weight, add a bit more carbon protection, and bang, we're going to pass it the second time. Alpine, however, turned up thinking their car was fine. It wasn't fine. They apparently failed the crash test, with absolutely basically 0 marks on their scorecard in the positive direction. So they had to add way more weight to their car so that it's actually safe and legal to run in the Grand Prix. And therefore they had so much more weight than expected. So they've had to strip all the paint off the car and it's just really heavy. I can't believe you've got a dramatically overweight car in year 3. This was understandably a problem for some teams in the first few months of 2022. Certainly Red Bull had this issue. They were just trying to take the weight out of the car. 10 kg, that's going to be 3/10 a lap. That's at least what they say. And it was understandable. The cost cap limitations, the amount of, challenging season that it was in 2021 for all teams, to go into 2022, brand new set of regulations, so much to understand. It was understandable that at the start of that season, the cars might be overweight. The next year, basically every car was on the money. To be overweight in year 3 it's just straight up embarrassing. And also we know that Alpine have the weakest engine on the grid. They're a good, 10, 15, 20. I think Alpine would probably say they're like 30 horsepower down. I'm not so sure if that's true. The other teams have said, well, of course they're going to exaggerate the deficit, but there is some deficit in the power unit between Alpine and the rest of the grid. So they tend to have to run less downforce, so their car goes as fast in a straight line, then they suffer in the corners. It's like everything possible that could be wrong with a car and a team is basically wrong with Alpine. So this has been a discussion of the last few days. Joe Soward mentioned this in his most recent Green Notebook as well from just after Jeddah on exactly what's going on behind the scenes at Renault, right? It's Alpine as it's known now, formerly the Renault team. There's also questions as, is Alpine even a worthwhile brand to name it after? I think I've seen one Alpine ever in real life. So I'm not exactly sure that brand is taken off, but that's anecdotal. So, make of that what you will. Of course, back in the day, there were Renault, then they were still Renault, then they pulled out and just did engines, of course, with Red Bull, then they were back in as Alpine, Renault first and then as Alpine, and then they might be gone again. So this is the rumour as it stands. The Renault boss, Luca Di Maio, who turned up to Jeddah with a mini busload of Renault execs in his wake, of course. They are, by the way, dead last in the championship Alpine right now. They have the worst car on the grid, and it's not like Jeddah was a great race by any means for them because Gasly didn't even get to start the Grand Prix. He's not too happy, Luca Di Maio, with the progress being made, if you can even call it progress, made at Alpine, and the plan to conquer the world is proving harder than he thought it would. And this is what Otmar Schaffner was saying as well. He was like, look, if you're not going to give us the resources, this sport is more challenging than you think it is type thing. And he was fired for that. And what was it, his name? Lauren Rossi, he came in and basically said, no, we need to do a better job. You guys are all amateurs. And then he got fired. So it's a complete mess, right? We talked to them as, we talked about these guys as the French Ferrari, which in some ways they were. But nowadays, since Fred Vasseur's come into Ferrari, something about a French team principle, I don't know, at least in a non-French team, it just seems to work, and Ferrari actually seem like a stable force that is moving in a positive direction. Alpine continue to slide. So the Renault boss now needs to decide what to do, something that he might just sell the Enstone operation and use the money made to invest in the motorsport engine business and not try and get the British and the French working together, which is a fair point maybe. Renault has done this before and enjoyed much success with Red Bull Racing as its representative, of course. Red Bull didn't necessarily enjoy that period, but I guess it worked for Renault. There are heavily loaded investors desperate to get into F1 at the moment, and one can imagine a deal which would see Alpine branding continuing as part of the deal, but without the hassle of having to run the team, and that is honestly a very fair point. We know that there is so much interest to get into this sport right now. Teams are begging to get into the sport. They would love to buy a team if the option was there. Haas are saying, we don't want to sell. And I've obviously criticised that decision by Gene Haas in the past because Haas are never going to be a championship challenger just the way they're set up, but to be fair to Haas, they're doing a better job this year than I thought they'd be doing, and maybe part of that is just because Alpine have done an absolutely shocking job. I don't know if Haas have necessarily done especially well this year, although I think you've got to give them some credit for actually fixing the car so that it can survive a Grand Prix without completely eating its tyres. I think it's more so the teams around them haven't really nailed it, let's be honest. But still, Gene Haas has said, I don't want to sell. It works for me. I've got my Haas, automation or whatever it's called company. That this is effectively advertising for. The team is arguably still going up in value, so Gene Haas doesn't see a reason to sell. And fair enough, I'm not there to make the decision for him. But people want to buy that Haas team if they could, and I don't think they would have expected another option to be on the table, right? Because Williams, they've now got their investors. All the top teams, you can basically forget about it unless potentially Aramco or just Saudi group in general, some sort of Saudi group, might completely take over Aston Martin, which has been rumoured for some time. Sauber are now Audi, as I say about Williams. So there aren't really any options elsewhere on the grid, apart from maybe Alpine now. This might help Michael Andretti get an entry and be able to run from 2025 to 2027 before the Cadillac power units arrive in 2028. So that's the big talking point, that we know that Andretti tried to come in as an 11th Formula 1 team. F1 said no, we don't think it makes sense from a business side. And that's a whole nother frustrating debate that I don't want to get into again. But if they were to buy a team, then of course it's a different story. And they would be free to potentially use the Cadillac power units that they still say they're making from 2028. And there were even rumours that if Andretti was to be granted the entry, they were going to run Renault engines. That was actually apparently a deal that was in place, that Andretti was going to use Renault Alpine engines for the couple of years before they get their own power units. So maybe this actually makes a fair bit of sense. Andretti could come in, buy the Alpine team, with the help of the Cadillac General Motors money, run it themselves, maybe still have some sort of Alpine branding relationship so that it works for Alpine. Renault can then focus their efforts on actually making a better engine, and maybe that makes sense for all parties. So just something to think about. Clearly, these are rumours that are going around, that if the current trend at Alpine continues, this is probably likely to occur. Renault are just, Alpine are just going backwards. Like, do you really see this team turning around? And even if they do turn it around, next season, let's say, where are they going to be? They're going to be back to 6th or 5th? I don't think they're going to get much better than that. So what's the point, really, if you're Renault and you're trying to replicate the success of 2005, 2006? It ain't happening anytime soon. So maybe this is the more sensible option, and the feeling is that this could happen as soon as next year. Maybe if Luca Di Maio sees the next couple of races, let's not forget Australia wasn't good for them last year either. Their guys crashed into each other on the restart and both scored no points. So if they have another bad couple of stretch of races, I think it's feasible that Renault decide, this is the more sensible approach for the business in the future, and then Michael Andretti, with the big backing that he has, could come in and potentially get the job done. Or another investor group potentially could be the case as well. Just to look at some of the numbers, these are improvement figures last year to this year from the various teams. This is in Bahrain, by the way. Most teams improving by rather a lot. Alpine got worse. They were slower by 1/10 of a second compared to last year's car. This is also rather damning as well. Average qualifying gap and dry sessions only, but we've only had dry sessions. Red Bull, Ferrari, Aston, McLaren, Mercedes. That's your top 5. Then you have quite a big gap to RB. Haas are the 7th fastest team on paper, then Williams, then Sauber, and then Alpine. From 6th fastest last year to the dead slowest car this year, and even, 2% off Red Bull. Pretty damn bad compared to where we have been the last couple of years. So after Formula 1 rejected Andretti's entry, there was lots of talk as to what Andretti were going to do next. They did themselves come out with a statement at the time and say, Andretti Cadillac has received the information Formula Management Limited has shared, strongly disagrees with the content. Andretti say they will continue working on their highly competitive car and engine. So look, if Formula 1 don't want to let them in themselves, because if you allow an 11th team in, you split the pie of what are effectively franchises. I think even some of the teams themselves have started to refer to themselves as franchises, which is effectively the American sports model, which is basically what we currently have in Formula 1, although it's not explicitly said like that, although there have been some Freudian slips, I think, from team principals that have said that. So, from a business side, from an economic side, they don't see the sense in it. But if Andretti was to buy a team, then of course it's a rather different story. Just one final thing I wanted to mention for you guys, because this is certainly going to be relevant at times in Australia and basically everywhere at the moment. Austria was the circuit where this has been most problematic over the last couple of years, and that comes down to track limits. It's a frustratingly consistent and persistent topic right now in the sport that never seems to go away, but there has been some testing done over the last few days to use what they call artificial intelligence. I'm not even so sure that it is really. I think this is just when people use the AI buzzwords to say that everything's AI. I'm pretty sure what it really is just cameras that look at the corner and the camera determines whether it's gone, whether the tyre is over the line or not. I don't think that's necessarily AI. Maybe there is some AI involved. But nonetheless, there's been testing over the last few days to see whether computerized tracking of track limits is actually plausible, which it certainly is. And I think 99% of track limits violations should be determined by computerization. And then the 1% that's very much on the line and is like really difficult to tell, then maybe you get the humans to review that. I don't know. But Austria was a nightmare previously with all the track limits violations that came out after the fact, and they couldn't even police them at the time. Even last year in Austin, everyone was going off at turn 6 and they were getting away with it because the camera wasn't in place there. Absolute mess. So this should be possible. It probably will be possible. There are other ways to resolve track limits as well. Like, how about we just put some gravel where if you go over track limits, your tyres are in the gravel. Then the drivers would very quickly learn not to go outside of track limits. But if they're not going to do that, using computerization and cameras to actually analyze this makes way more sense than getting people manually to look at every single car that goes past turn 10 at Austria and figure out whether they've got outside or not. They've got to figure this out, and apparently they're trying. Whether it'll work, that's another question. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. I did just see this as well, because I think many of us, including myself, would like to see Australia be the first race of the calendar yet again. This is going to be the case next year. If you guys haven't heard about this, Australia will be the opening race of next season. It's probably Ramadan related again. I don't know if that's going to be the case forever or if it's going to be back to the start of the calendar again for the rest of time. But I'm almost certain that next year they start in Melbourne. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.